Welcome to AHRC TV's weekly roundup. In this week's program, devastating earthquake in Nepal, AHRC TV reports from the ground. AHRC TV gives you an Asia-wide report on International Press Freedom Day. Last-minute reprieve for Filipino Mary Jane Veloso sentenced to death in Indonesia.
Now I'm in front of Torikal, where thousands of earthquake survivors are taking shelter here without drinking water, food, and any water and sanitation facilities.
Welcome to AHRC TV's weekly roundup. I'm Josephina Bergston. We begin with a massive earthquake measuring 7.9 on the Richter scale, which struck Nepal on April 25 and devastated the country, causing thousands of human casualties and other damage across the Himalayan nation. More than 5,000 lives have been lost and the number is still going up. Up to 8 million people in 39 districts have been affected, with over 2 million people living in the 11 most severely affected districts. Aftershocks continue to affect the daily lives of people, forcing them to spend nights sleeping out in the open, with meteorologists predicting continued chilly rainfall for the coming week. The many large aftershocks also risk causing further damage to infrastructure already damaged by the initial quake. Nepal was largely unprepared for a crisis like this and is struggling to coordinate an emergency response. Thousands of displaced victims in Kathmandu have expressed anger towards the government, as they already face food and water shortages. Although the world community has responded urgently and immediately, the steady supply of relief materials, especially water, food, and medicine, is insufficient to match the needs. Some of the most affected districts, like Gorkha, Dading, Lamjung, Kavre, Nuwakot, outside of Kathmandu, have still not yet been reached, leaving them to fend for themselves. The Asian Human Rights Commission calls on the international community to be careful while providing aid, as it will be of little use to the affected people if it's lost to corrupt officials and bad management. The government of Nepal needs to show complete transparency and accountability when receiving and distributing international aid and relief packages. The AHRC further urges the government of Nepal to ensure that rescue and relief teams are deployed in remote districts of Nepal as quickly as possible. Provisions are made for adequate relief materials, especially water, food, and medicines, to these areas. Arrange clean water and sanitation services without delay. That arrangements are put in place immediately for the safe and dignified disposal of bodies of victims. We continue on the topic of freedom of expression, as International Day of Press Freedom falls on Sunday, May 3rd. According to international watchdog Reporters Without Borders Annual Press Freedom Index, Asian countries fare badly compared with other regions around the world. Only Taiwan, Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, South Korea, and Hong Kong make it into the top 10, with the rest of Asia's many countries ranked in the bottom third of the index. Most countries are faring worse than last year's index, with previous high-scoring Hong Kong hitting a new low amid concern that Beijing is exerting increasing control over the city's media. The 2015 index placed Hong Kong 70th in its 2015 index, down from 61st last year and 58th the year before. Press freedom in the territory was rated 18th best in the world in 2002, 5 years after the territory returned to Chinese rule. In other Asian countries, India is one rare jurisdiction in Asia where the media has a relatively high degree of freedom. There is, however, an elaborate regulatory and licensing framework in India which, in comparison to other countries where press freedom exists in letter and spirit, can be viewed as restrictive. Free press is not a constitutional guarantee in India. However, Article 19(1)(a) of the Indian Constitution guarantees freedom of speech and expression. Restrictions enforced are limited to acts that infringe the sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency or morality, or acts that relate to contempt of court, defamation, or incitement to an offence. Through a series of judgments, the Supreme Court of India has interpreted freedom of speech and expression as having no geographical limitation, carrying with it the right of a citizen to gather information and to exchange thought with others. Furthermore, the press has been acknowledged to play a significant role in the democratic machinery, and the courts have the duty to uphold this freedom and invalidate all laws and administrative actions that abridge the freedom. In India, executive orders cannot be issued to limit freedom of speech and expression. In 2002, the court further interpreted the constitutional guarantee and said that one-sided information, disinformation, misinformation, and non-information all equally create an uninformed citizenry, which makes democracy a farce. In fact, this is precisely the problem in India today. The Indian media, though free when compared to counterparts in Asia, suffers from self-censorship and corporatization today. The AHRC caught up with Mr. Sachin Jain of Vikas Samwad, an Indian organization that puts to practice the concept media for rights.
Structurally, I feel media in India has been a free media. India has a character where that media can be considered as free media, and it has no restrictions from the. It has been facing no restrictions from the state as such. There are a few points which are very important. The one thing is that 90% of Indian media is controlled by the corporates. And if they have their own interest in running a media group or a media product, in that situation it will be difficult to expect them to examine the approach of the executive, then restrict unauthorized intervention or expose, because they have their own interests on the one hand. Second hand, if you have a few media institutions who were not having business interests primarily, after having interventions in media, after having media houses, they have created business interests. So this is another thing. If you see what they are actually doing, media houses are not only engaged in media work alone. They have vested interest in market, almost in every sector: mining, export, real estate, thermal power, tourism, hotel, construction, school and higher education, health. Everywhere they have interventions. They are involved in doing business. So, and these are the sectors where you can see that most of the human rights violations can be seen. Means poor people are not getting health services, poor children are not getting quality education, because privatization is growing up, and these media houses are playing dual role in this situation. Where on the one hand, they are running media houses, and through media, they are actually creating an environment in favor of privatization and capitalist approach towards these basic and fundamental services. And on the other hand, they themselves are engaged in doing business on these things.
Now to the media situation in Sri Lanka. Over a period of about 10 years, under former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, several journalists were killed, many seriously physically harmed, and many other crimes were committed against journalists in Sri Lanka. International Journalists Association have published a long list of such atrocities. The new government elected into power on January 8 this year had promised to investigate and to prosecute all such crimes against journalists. However, over 100 days have passed after the coming into power of President Maithripala Sirisena's government, and no one has been arrested nor brought before courts for the murders and other crimes relating to journalists. President Maithripala Sirisena, after coming into power, invited all journalists who have left Sri Lanka due to persecution by the former government to come back to Sri Lanka and promised to guarantee their security. However, many of these journalists have stated that until former crimes against journalists are being investigated and prosecuted, they would not consider Sri Lanka as a safe place for journalists to return to. We now return to the dire media situation in Pakistan. Freedom of expression in Pakistan is a misnomer and exists in name only under Article 19 of the Constitution of Pakistan. The state actively suppresses political and religious dissent and exerts political and economic pressure on any media group that dares to defy the ban on criticizing state policies and questioning economic interests. Journalists, activists, and human rights defenders are all targets for expressing dissenting views. In Pakistan, religion and political freedom of expression has always been crushed forcefully by both civil and military regimes. Media blackouts on issues of Balochistan and sectarian violence is the norm. For more, AHRC TV spoke with lawyer and researchers Javeria Yunus.
The situation in Pakistan in terms of the freedom of expression is quite dismal. People absolutely have no freedom of expression, and with the advent of promulgation of laws such as prevention of cybercrime laws that is about to be passed in Pakistan, people would not be allowed to speak against the government or the state or the military on social sites as well. There's going to be a major clampdown on all of dissent that will appear on the social sites as well in the blogs. So in terms of the freedom of expression, Pakistan is regressing, and the problem is that dissent is not tolerated by the state or even the masses. It has seeped so much, the intolerance has seeped so much into the society that freedom of expression has become a misnomer, a complete misnomer, though it has been guaranteed under the Constitution of Pakistan. The journalists in Pakistan, both the vernacular press as well as the English press, are increasingly targeted by the state and the establishment, both the military and the civil. And they have been targeted for speaking out against the economic and political interests of the government, especially in terms of the Balochistan issue and the Gwadar issue that is coming up between China and Pakistan. There's a lot of interest in Balochistan these days. So when it comes to the human rights violation that the state is increasingly going on in there, the human rights defenders are increasingly targeted for speaking out against these human rights violations. So media in Pakistan is basically used by the state directly or indirectly to forward their own views, to impose their own views, their own ideas onto public. People are increasingly encouraged not to think for themselves. This is the real dilemma of the society in Pakistan that I feel. So state is increasingly use freedom of expression, clamping down freedom of expression to manufacture consent of the masses and to forward their own agenda.
And now to Indonesia. Although Indonesia fares badly at number 138 on the Press Freedom Index, in Jakarta and some other big cities in Indonesia, press freedom is not an overt problem. However, the real problem is seen to be with the owners of media houses, as some have in recent years established political parties, which calls into question the independence of the media. Outside of the metropolitan areas of Indonesia, the situation is much worse. Media work in Papua and many other provinces remain dangerous, with journalists frequently subjected to extrajudicial killings, torture, and other types of crimes meant to silence them. For further information, AHRC TV spoke with human rights lecturer Dr. Herlambang, coordinator for Sepaham, Indonesia.
Indonesian press freedom, especially after Suharto, there are still have numerous serious problems. Especially, we still have the situation that the journalists can be easily attacked. For instance, like extrajudicial killings, stabbing, torturing, or burning the papers, offices in various places. Not in Jakarta, but from the Aceh to Papua, we still have sort of physical attacks. The second, the issue is also very important, is about suppressive legislations. We have criminal law, which really the government use this kind of laws to attack the journalists, especially by using criminal defamation. And in this context, the court is also a part of an intimidation mechanism. On the other hand, the journalist is also facing impunity system, which is seriously sort of making a strong protecting the violators in order to maintain their interest, especially the journalists. Professional journalism is the most targeted because they reported about corruption and natural resources excessive exploitation. So this kind of journalism are the most dangerous reports.
As Press Freedom Day is marked in Bangladesh, several media professionals are detained in prisons. Restrictions on exposing transgressions by the ruling government are increasing day by day. Exercising the freedom of press independently in print and electronic or social media is highly challenging in the country today. At least 3 journalists and 2 heads of media houses are currently in detention. Kanak Sarwar, a senior reporter at private TV channel ETV, has been detained since early March this year. Kanak was an anchor person of a popular TV show called People's Voice. He has been charged in a sedition case. Mizanur Rahman, correspondent of daily newspaper Prothom Alo, was detained also in March for arguing with a police officer. He was tortured by the police and allegedly has been charged with a fabricated extortion case filed by a ruling party local leader. Meanwhile, Hafizur Rahman, correspondent of daily Sangram, was detained in February. The local police called him into the station and detained him in an alleged fabricated case of arson attack on a public bus. Apart from these journalists, Mahmudur Rahman, acting editor of the daily Amar Desh, has been arbitrarily detained since April 2013. Police and the ruling party have allegedly fabricated 68 cases against him, including car vandalizing. Finally, Abdus Salam, chairman and CEO of ETV, has been detained since early January this year. He was broadcasting a speech of an exiled senior opposition leader and was arrested immediately after. In the Philippines, the killing of Melinda Maxino on April 13, a former newspaper correspondent who previously reported on corruption and operation of illegal numbers game, demonstrates a continuing pattern of targeted attacks on Philippine press. Maxino was a former correspondent for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, a national daily, and had herself been threatened in 2005 for doing her work. She was the 173rd journalist to be killed in the Philippines since 1986 after the fall of the Marcos regime. Her murder shows a pattern of ongoing attacks on the Filipino press freedom, from death threats to libel charges to murder. In fact, under President Aquino's administration, Maxino was the 32nd journalist to have been killed. During his predecessor, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo's presidency, the Philippines recorded the largest number of journalists killed in a single incident, the infamous Maguindanao massacre in 2009. To mark the World Press Freedom Day, AHRC TV spoke with Mirna Reblano. Mirna is the widow of Alejandro Bong Reblano, one of the journalists killed in the Maguindanao massacre.
This is the sign of lack of press freedom in the Philippines, and it's very frustrating. After more than 5 long years of waiting, that the justice will be served, but until now, I can say that we haven't had any clear evidence to expect that the justice will be served soon. 58 people and 32 journalists was killed on that incident. I just want to ask from not only from our government, but to mostly to the media as well to help us again, especially on this coming month, that it's really hard for us as a family of victims of that massacre is still waiting for a long time. It's one of our agony and sufferings.
Our final report on press freedom in Asia is from Burma, where despite the opening up of the country in the last few years, freedom of press is still under threat. Some journalists have been sentenced to long prison terms under criminal law charges. In the recent brutal student protest crackdown in Letpadan, the police also attacked a number of journalists and some were arrested. Burma ranks 144th out of 180 countries in the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index for 2015 and placed in the top 10 of the most censored countries in the world, according to Committee to Protect Journalists. The only other Asian countries in the top 10 are North Korea, China, and Vietnam, along with the Eurasian country of Azerbaijan. Reporters Without Borders stated that Burma's government, which consists of mainly former army officers who were in the previous military government, showed signs of a return to strict news control in 2014 after a year of significant democratic reforms in 2012. In a final piece of good news, in an otherwise tragic news cycle coming out of Indonesia, Mary Jane Veloso, the Filipino migrant worker who was convicted and sentenced to death for drug smuggling into Indonesia, was spared, given a surprise last-minute reprieve. The execution by firing squad was scheduled to take place around midnight between April 28 and 29, along with 8 other convicted drug smugglers from Australia, Brazil, Nigeria, and Indonesia. Pleas for clemency came in from governments, individuals, as well as organizations from around the world, asking Indonesian President Joko Widodo to spare the 9. However, all the others were executed, but Veloso was spared for now, ostensibly so that she can witness against the woman accused of trafficking her. Veloso maintains that she was unaware of the content of the bag she was asked to carry from Malaysia to Indonesia. That is all for this weekly roundup. For more on these and other issues, please visit www.humanrights.asia. Thank you for watching and see you next week.